No one in Bitterroot Valley expected the storm to turn their homes into iceboxes. But what they never saw coming was that the only place left warm, the only place still breathing with life when everything else froze solid, would be the strange, half-buried cabin they'd all laughed at for months, and the woman inside it, Lena Carver, who had quietly built her home into an earthen berm as if she knew something the rest of them didn't. It started the previous fall, when the valley was still golden with dry grass and the air carried that crisp promise of winter without the danger. When Lena first began reshaping her land in a way that made no sense to anyone watching from the road. Instead of clearing space for a traditional cabin like most landowners did, she brought in rented equipment and carved into a gentle slope, pushing soil upward and around in a deliberate crescent until a thick, curved berm rose from the ground like a protective wall. And then, instead of building outward, she built inward, anchoring her structure directly into the earth, reinforcing it with layered insulation, pressure-treated beams, and compacted soil that wrapped around 3 sides of the cabin like a shield, leaving only the front exposed with a heavy steel-reinforced door and narrow, deeply set windows angled to catch light, but deflect wind. And people noticed. Of course they noticed, because in a place like Bitterroot, where everyone kept an eye on what their neighbors were doing, something that unusual didn't go ignored for long. At the general store, conversations turned toward her in that half-amused, half-judgmental tone people used when they didn't understand something. Some said she was paranoid, others said she was trying to build some kind of bunker, and a few younger locals even drove out just to film her property from a distance, posting clips online with captions like, "Mountain Hermit builds underground house," laughing as if the whole thing were a joke. And the loudest voice among them was Tom Whitaker, a retired contractor who had built his reputation on crafting solid, traditional homes, and who had recently finished a wide, open-concept house just down the road from Lena's land, complete with tall windows, modern insulation, and a backup generator system he proudly claimed could handle anything Montana winters threw at it. "You don't bury a house unless you're afraid of something," he said one afternoon, leaning against the counter at the store while Lena quietly paid for another load of insulation boards and sealant. "And if you're that afraid, maybe you shouldn't be living out here." The comment drew a few chuckles, and Lena didn't respond. She never responded, but she didn't change what she was doing either. And that, more than anything, unsettled people, because there was no hesitation in her work, no trial-and-error approach. Every trench she dug, every layer she added, every angle she set into the structure seemed pre-planned, as if she were following a blueprint that existed entirely in her head. What no one in the valley knew was that Lena hadn't always lived there, and she hadn't always been so quiet. Years earlier, she had worked across multiple northern states in seasonal disaster response, taking contracts that placed her in the aftermath of storms most people only saw on the news, and she had seen firsthand what happened when systems failed. Not just power grids, but assumptions. The belief that modern homes were enough simply because they were new, because they looked strong, because they had technology backing them up, and again, she had watched those assumptions collapse under conditions they weren't designed to handle, especially in one particular kind of storm that most people underestimated. Prolonged freezing rain, the kind that didn't announce itself with blizzards or high winds at first, but instead crept in quietly, coating everything in layers of ice until structures strained, systems locked up, and movement itself became dangerous. And over the past 2 winters, as she settled into Bitterroot Valley, she had started to notice patterns, subtle shifts in temperature swings, the timing of cold fronts, the way early-season moisture lingered just long enough to create the conditions for something worse. And she didn't talk about it, didn't warn anyone, because she knew how it would sound, knew that people who hadn't seen it before wouldn't understand. So instead, she prepared in the only way she trusted, by building a home that didn't rely on anything that could fail. Inside the berm, her cabin took shape as something entirely different from the houses around it. The earth itself became part of the insulation, stabilizing internal temperatures against the extremes outside, while her walls, thick, sealed, and reinforced, eliminated drafts entirely. And instead of large windows that bled heat, she installed small, triple-layered panes set deep into the structure, designed not for views but for efficiency, and her heating system wasn't dependent on electricity or fuel lines that could freeze. It was simple, controlled, and backed by thermal mass built into the floors, allowing heat to be stored and released slowly over time. And even her ventilation system was manual, with protected shafts that could be adjusted without relying on powered fans, because she had learned the hard way that anything requiring constant external input was a point of failure waiting to happen. By the time winter began to settle in for real, her cabin no longer looked like a construction site. Grass had started to reclaim the berm, softening its edges until it blended into the landscape so naturally that from a distance, it barely registered as a structure at all. And still, the comments didn't stop. If anything, they became more confident, because to everyone else, winter was something they understood, something they had prepared for in their own ways, with stocked pantries, insulated pipes, and backup power systems ready to kick in if needed. And Lena's choices seemed excessive, even irrational, compared to what they considered normal. And yet, on certain mornings when the frost clung a little thicker to the ground than expected, or when the air carried a damp chill that didn't quite match the forecast, Lena would stand outside her cabin for a moment longer than usual, looking out across the valley with a stillness that wasn't worry exactly, but recognition, like she was seeing the early outlines of something no one else had noticed yet. And then she would step back inside, close the heavy door behind her, and return to a space that was quiet, controlled, and ready in a way the rest of the valley simply wasn't, even if they believed, right up until the first thin layer of ice began to form on an otherwise ordinary December afternoon, that they were. The storm didn't arrive the way storms usually did in Bitterroot Valley. There were no warning sirens, no walls of snow rolling over the mountains, no sudden, violent winds to make people pause and rethink their plans. It began quietly, almost politely, as a cold drizzle that tapped gently against windows on a gray December afternoon, the kind of weather most residents barely noticed as they went about their routines, running errands, checking livestock, or settling in for the evening. And at first, nothing about it seemed unusual, because winter rain wasn't unheard of, and forecast had mentioned light precipitation. Nothing more, nothing dangerous. But what those forecasts didn't capture, what they couldn't fully predict, was the narrow, shifting band of temperature hanging just above the valley. A fragile balance that began to collapse as the sun dipped lower, and within hours, that harmless drizzle turned into something else entirely, as the air temperature dropped just enough for every raindrop to freeze on contact, coating surfaces in a thin, glassy layer that spread faster than anyone expected. And still, people didn't panic. Not yet, because ice storms, while inconvenient, had come and gone before without major consequence. But this one didn't stop. It didn't pass through. It lingered, feeding on itself as wave after wave of freezing rain rolled in, each layer building on the last until tree branches began to sag under the growing weight, bending lower and lower with quiet creaks that echoed through the still air, and power lines followed soon after, dipping dangerously as ice thickened around them, until the first sharp crack split the silence somewhere across the valley, followed by the sudden flicker of lights going out in clusters, then spreading, house by house, street by street, until entire stretches of Bitterroot were swallowed in darkness. Inside his home, Tom Whitaker noticed the outage immediately, but at first he wasn't concerned. This was exactly why he had invested in a backup generator system, something he had bragged about more than once, confident it would keep his house running no matter what winter threw at it. But when he stepped outside to check on it, the reality was already shifting beyond his control. The generator's intake was beginning to ice over, its components stiffening in the cold, and despite his efforts to clear it, the machine sputtered, coughed, and ultimately failed to start, leaving him standing there in the growing silence, the faint hum of modern life replaced by something heavier, more unsettling, as the cold began to seep into his home almost immediately. And it wasn't just him. Across the valley, similar scenes were playing out as people discovered that their carefully planned systems were far more fragile than they had believed. Because this wasn't just a power outage, it was a complete environmental lockdown, with roads turning into sheets of unwalkable ice, vehicles immobilized, and emergency services stretched thin within the first few hours, unable to reach those in need as conditions worsened. The freezing rain continued relentlessly, hour after hour, layering the valley in thick, heavy ice that transformed everything into a rigid, glittering landscape, beautiful in a distant, almost surreal way, but deadly up close, as roofs began to groan under the accumulating weight, and tree limbs snapped without warning, crashing down onto driveways, fences, and in some cases, homes themselves. And inside those homes, the temperature kept dropping because without power, even the best insulation could only slow the inevitable, not stop it. And large windows, once a source of pride and openness, became silent drains of heat, leaching warmth into the frozen night until interiors grew colder and colder, breath turning visible in the air as people layered blankets, lit whatever safe heat sources they could manage, and waited for the storm to pass, assuming it would end soon, that help would come, that this was temporary. But it wasn't. By the time the storm reached its second night, the valley had been encased in ice for nearly 36 hours straight, an unbroken assault that left structures strained, systems frozen, and people increasingly desperate as supplies dwindled and temperatures inside their homes dropped to dangerous levels. And what made it worse was the silence that settled in between the sounds of cracking branches and falling debris, a heavy, isolating quiet that made it clear just how cut off they had become, with no cell service, no working power, and no safe way to travel even short distances without risking a fall or worse. And yet, just beyond the road, partially hidden beneath a smooth, grass-covered berm, Lena Carver sat inside her cabin, listening to the faint, distant sounds of the storm without feeling its bite, because inside her home, the temperature remained steady, held in place by the very earth surrounding her, insulating her from the extremes outside in a way no conventional structure could replicate. And while the ice continued to build, sealing the valley into a frozen trap, her walls didn't creak, her systems didn't fail, and her heat didn't fade, because she hadn't built her home to fight the environment. She had built it to exist within it, protected by it. And as the hours stretched into days, and the storm showed no sign of letting up, the difference between her cabin and every other house in Bitterroot Valley became something far more than unusual design. It became the line between stability and collapse, between safety and exposure, between those who could wait out the storm and those who were beginning to realize they might not survive it. By the time the freezing rain finally stopped, it didn't feel like the storm had ended. It felt like the world had simply been abandoned in place, sealed under a hard, glittering shell that reflected the pale winter light with an eerie stillness. And when Lena Carver pushed open the heavy door of her berm cabin that third morning, the silence outside hit her harder than the cold ever could, because there were no engines, no distant voices, no movement at all, just the occasional sharp crack of a branch giving way under the weight of ice somewhere in the distance, echoing like a warning through the valley. She stepped out carefully, her boots gripping the frozen ground with the cleats she had strapped on, her breath steady, her movements deliberate, because she already understood what that silence meant, and it wasn't something she could ignore, not after everything she had seen in other places, other winters, where storms like this had turned hesitation into tragedy. She scanned the valley from the slight rise of her land and saw it clearly now. The sagging power lines, the trees bowed into unnatural shapes, the rooftops glazed in thick, unmoving ice. And she knew that inside those homes, people were running out of time, because no matter how well-built a structure was, without heat, without power, without mobility, it would eventually fail the people inside it. So she didn't wait for a signal or a call for help that might never come. She went back inside, gathered what she needed: ropes, a compact sled, thermal blankets, spare gloves, and secured one end of a heavy guide line to a reinforced anchor just outside her door, a precaution she had installed months ago for exactly this kind of zero-traction, low-visibility scenario, then wrapped the other end around her harness and stepped back into the frozen world, each movement careful and measured as she began making her way toward the nearest house. The journey that would have taken minutes on a normal day stretched into nearly an hour, every step a negotiation with the ice beneath her, every shift of weight deliberate as she used the rope to maintain balance and direction. And when she reached Tom Whitaker's place, she found the front steps encased in a thick layer of frozen rain, the door stiff but not sealed, and inside, the air hit her like a wall of cold, sharper than outside because it carried that still, trapped quality of a space that had lost its heat entirely. Tom was there, bundled in blankets, his face pale, his movements slow, but his eyes widened when he saw her standing in the doorway, not with surprise so much as a kind of dawning realization, as if everything he had dismissed about her over the past months was suddenly rearranging itself into something undeniable. "Can you stand?" she asked, her voice calm, direct, leaving no room for argument, and he nodded after a moment, though it took effort, his body stiff from the cold, and together they moved carefully back outside, Lena securing him to the guide rope behind her so that if he slipped, he wouldn't fall away, and step by step, slower than before, they made the return journey, the wind biting harder now that the storm had passed but the cold remained, and when they finally reached the berm and she pulled open the heavy door, the change was immediate, almost disorienting, warmth, steady and enveloping, wrapping around them like something alive, and Tom stopped just inside, his breath catching as he looked around the interior of the cabin, not in confusion anymore, but in something closer to disbelief, because the place he had mocked, the one he had called impractical, was now the only space he had seen in days that felt untouched by the storm. But Lena didn't let the moment linger. She got him settled, checked his condition quickly, and as soon as she was sure he was stable, she turned back toward the door, because she knew there would be others, and there were. Over the next day, she made multiple trips, each one as demanding as the last, navigating the frozen terrain with the same controlled precision, following the rope out and back, extending her reach further each time, bringing back a young couple who had been stranded in their car after trying to leave too late, an elderly woman whose furnace had failed completely, a small family who had been huddled in a single room, trying to conserve what little warmth they had left, and each time they entered the berm cabin, the reaction was the same, a moment of stunned silence as the reality of the space sank in, as their bodies registered the warmth, the stability, the absence of the biting cold that had taken over everything else. Inside, the cabin transformed from a solitary shelter into something else entirely, a shared refuge, quiet but alive, filled with the low sounds of people recovering, breathing easier, speaking in hushed tones as they processed what had happened, and through it all, Lena moved with the same steady focus she had shown from the beginning, managing supplies, rationing heat, making sure everyone had what they needed without panic or waste. Because this wasn't improvisation for her, it was execution, the result of months of preparation meeting exactly the kind of conditions she had anticipated. By the time emergency crews finally managed to reach Bitterroot Valley days later, carving their way through ice-covered roads and fallen debris, they were bracing for the worst, expecting to find homes abandoned or worse. But what they found instead was something that didn't quite fit the reports. A group of survivors gathered inside a low, earth-covered structure that looked almost like part of the landscape itself, intact, stable, and warm, standing in quiet contrast to the damage surrounding it. And as word spread in the days that followed, the story shifted from the storm to the woman who had outlasted it, the one who had built differently, who had prepared for something no one else had taken seriously, and Tom, standing outside his own damaged home weeks later, would be the first to say it out loud, not with pride, but with a kind of humbled clarity. "I built a house that needed everything to work," he admitted, glancing toward the berm in the distance. "She built one that didn't need anything to survive." And that was the lesson that stayed, long after the ice melted and the valley began to rebuild. Not fear, not panic, but a quiet understanding that strength didn't always look the way people expected it to, and sometimes, the safest place wasn't the one that stood above everything else, but the one that knew how to disappear into the earth and endure.